For 8 weeks, I eagerly anticipated every Sunday evening, counting down the days until I got to see what new shocking developments would unfold in Oswald Cobb's rise to power. Last week, that incredible journey reached its explosive conclusion, but HBO promised not to give me a break as their next series, Dune Prophecy, took the Penguin's place the very next week. I hope to keep up my habit of looking forward to each Sunday evening with relish, but after the pilot to Dune Prophecy dropped, I admit, I'm not sure that'll be the case. Don't get me wrong, I love the world of Dune, and I'm curious where the show is going, so I will definitely keep watching. But so far, the new show has not yet reached the incredibly high bar set by the Penguin. Now, before you ask how I can judge a show based on its first episode alone, let me clarify that I'm not judging the entire show on this one episode. I'm just judging how well it hooks me into the story so far, which is an incredibly important thing for a television series to do well. If I'm being totally honest, if I wasn't already a big fan of Frank Herbert's world and Denis Villeneuve's films, I don't think I'd be coming back next week. Not because the episode had nothing good in it, far from it. I liked a lot of elements of the production. It just didn't get me engaged in the story like the Penguin did from its very first scene. And as dark as the Penguin got, every brutal murder in that show pales in comparison to the shockingly disturbing death at the end of the Dune episode, which nearly turned me off entirely, but that's besides the point. So let's compare the pilot episodes of these two series to see what sets them apart. But if you're new to the channel, I'm just thinking out loud here, so if you like my brain vomit, you know where the like and subscribe buttons are. Now without further ado, let's dive into it. First of all, let's look at the Penguin's brilliant opening episode and see how it set up its story so flawlessly. It's a direct sequel to The Batman. Its groundwork was already laid by the previous movie, but in case you forgot how that film ended, this episode begins with about a minute of news footage, showing you the aftermath of the Riddler's attack and explaining all the key pieces of information. A week has passed since the destruction of the film, the city is in chaos, Carmine Falcone is dead, and his son Alberto is his heir. That's all we need to know for background, and it's very succinctly laid out for us in a way that feels totally natural. Then for the story's big inciting incident, we have Alberto's death. This scene does so much at once, not only kicking off the plot with a bang, but brilliantly introducing us to Oz. We see him willing to get his hands dirty as he sneaks around like an opportunistic scavenger. We see him talk his way out of getting his head blown off. We get a look inside his motivation as he monologues to Alberto. And finally, we get to see how impulsive he is and how fragile his ego can be when he shoots the new kingpin for insulting him, only afterward realizing just what an enormous mess he's gotten himself into. From there, the rest of the show's events are all part of the chain reaction Oz started in the first 10 minutes. The first episode follows Oz trying to cover up his murder from the Falcones and set up Salvador Moroni to take credit for it, all the while evading the vengeful suspicion of Sophia. Sure, the plot gets increasingly big and complicated as the episodes go by and the conflict escalates, but it all started with a single clear event to kick things off, and everything after can be clearly traced back to this one moment. How much more efficient can you get? Dune Prophecy, on the other hand, is not so efficient, in my opinion. The episode begins with at least 15 minutes of voiceover exposition by the main character, Valia Harkonnen, which not only gives us the historical background of the series, which includes the Butlerian Jihad, the founding of the Great Houses, and the origin of the Bene Gesserit, quite a lot to dump at once, but it also lays out everything we need to know about the main character's motivation. It doesn't just show us her connection and loyalty to the First Reverend Mother and her belief in her vision of control. She just tells us that she was devoted to the Reverend Mother's controversial cause and was thus her favorite, without giving any explanation as to why. Sure, the voiceover is intercut with scenes of a young Valia, but they don't really convey much that isn't said. And I don't care about what I'm seeing, because the show is just telling me what's going on and why, without giving me any reason to care. The writers have clearly mastered the rule of tell, don't show. The episode then proceeds to dump us into what feels like episode 5 of a super convoluted plot where there's a ton of crap going on, and I couldn't tell you why most of it matters or how it connects. I could rewatch the episode and take notes if I wanted to explain it to you, but the point of this video is to show how the series has failed so far to get me engaged. So to demonstrate, let me do my best to recount what I remember of the first episode's plot. The Emperor's daughter is engaged to an underage prince of another house, which the Emperor is not happy about for some reason. Meanwhile, Valia wants to train the same princess and put her on the throne as a Bene Gesserit for some reason. I guess it's all part of their grand plan, but I couldn't tell you why it's so important, and thus why I should care. Apparently, there's political unrest for some reason, and the Emperor's scared of losing control of the spice industry, though we don't know who the threat is, only that there's this creepy guy from Arrakis telling him as much, who's clearly up to no good. And one of the Bene Gesserit is having tons of bizarre visions about something the First Reverend Mother prophesied about, I guess. I really couldn't tell you much more than that. There's no clear jumping off point into the world and story. We're just thrown into the middle of it without a clue what's going on. There's a ton of cryptic talk about all sorts of stuff throughout the episode, but because we don't know why any of it matters or how any of it's connected, we have no reason to care enough to bother remembering it. I'm not saying there's not clues as to what's going on that I could pick up on if I paid more attention, and I'm sure a lot of this will be explained in time, but so much stuff going right over the audience's head so early on is not good for hooking them into the story. So that's how these two shows' initial episodes compare in their introduction to the world, characters, and plot. But there's something else I want to take a couple minutes to gripe about regarding Dune. These shows are very similar in that they are both spin-offs of very successful blockbuster action films associated with iconic IPs and drawing on tons of fascinating lore and world building. And I will applaud both for maintaining a sense of visual, tonal, and world building continuity with the original films while greatly expanding on their lore. However, while this level of consistency makes perfect sense in The Penguin, as it takes place in the same city as the Batman only a week later, Dune Prophecy takes place 10,000 years before the story of Paul Atreides. So, why does this universe look so similar that, as far as I can tell, it could take place within decades of the films? I don't just mean visually or stylistically, though, yes, even the costumes, props, and architecture are often identical to that in the films. But the major political and economic power dynamics we see in the films already seem largely well established, although it's only been a few hundred years since the Butlerian Jihad, so you'd imagine they'd still be building their civilization from the ground up. And they've got more time to develop before we see them next than we've had recorded history. I know a point of Dune's world building was that their culture and technological progress had sort of stagnated, but 10,000 years is a heck of a lot of time. And sure, I'll admit I'm not super familiar with the world building from the Brian Herbert books this show is drawing from, so maybe you can blame this complaint on the books, but the thing that made me realize this wasn't just a world building problem, but a deliberate choice by the creators of the show to remind us of the films as much as possible was the inclusion of the voice. This is an ability that takes a lifetime for Bene Gesserit to hone, and it's only possible thanks to millennia of selective breeding, granting them near psychic abilities. This skill of borderline supernatural subliminal persuasion took countless generations to develop and perfect, but in the show, Valia Harkonnen just made it up and perfected it all on her own as barely more than a child. Just because. The writers knew this was a show about the earliest origins of the Bene Gesserit, long before they should have such powers, but I guess the voice was just such an iconic part of the films that they had to include it somehow. Alright, I had to take a moment to bring up the world-building issues as long as I was on the topic of the show, but again, the biggest point I wanted to make in this video was merely how to start such an epic, complex television series full of plotting and intrigue and set in such a deep and expansive world, by giving the audience a clear foothold into the story and connecting them to the major characters. And this is something I don't think Dune Prophecy pulled off. I want this show to be good, and I really hope it gets better as it goes along. Not only do I love this world, but I would love to see more stories that show us that female characters can be front and center. They can be powerful, and they can be beloved, even in such male-focused franchises as this, as long as they're well-written characters and don't feel they need to sacrifice their femininity to be powerful. The Penguin did that with the character of Sophia Falcone, but this show could take it to a whole new level thanks to its focus on the Bene Gesserit order. So I want it to do well, and send a message to Hollywood that we don't have a problem with awesome female-led stories. We just have a problem with terribly written ones that just exist to pander to an obnoxious audience of activists. However, this show can only send that message if it does well. And to do well, it has to draw in massive audiences with a compelling and engaging story right off the bat, just like The Penguin. Unfortunately, I'm not sure its first episode will be able to do that. But maybe that's just me. What do you think? Did the new Dune series first episode work for you or not? What are your thoughts so far, and what are your hopes for the story as it progresses? What do you think makes for a good hook in a show like this to begin with? I can't wait to hear your thoughts, so please, join me in the comments. I hope to see you next time, so until then, never stay silent.